we wanted to create opportunities for people to gather, meet each other, and learn from each other. We've been honored to meet so many people in our travels and our work. Our hope is to bring people together, people living with disabilities and mental health conditions, and those who love them, researchers, advocates, and professionals, to bring their stories to a new audience. Our guests have interesting perspectives on a variety of topics, and we wanted to create a vehicle for them to share with others. We host 2 episodes a month and are thrilled that so many people are meeting us on Zoom. We ask that you type your questions in the chat. We will be extending the webinar for up to 10 minutes to accommodate questions. And if you'd like to stay on with us after that time, you are more than welcome to do so. The webinar is being recorded, and right now everyone is muted.
And I wanted to add, Shelley, we're so grateful to our friend and colleague, Alana Raffel, who is typing our captions today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alana. But right now, we'd like to take time to remember with gratitude, honor, and respect Representative John Lewis, whose passion and actions make him that great man who throughout life reminded us that civil rights are human rights. Representative Lewis was a staunch supporter of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and he was one of the co-sponsors in the 1990 Act. And in 2018, when the House of Representatives threatened to undermine and weaken the ADA, he literally rose to protect the ADA. He was called the conscience of Congress, and he made an important speech to protect the law and implored all of Congress to do the same. You must never give up, he said. You must be bold. You must be brave. You must be courageous and find a way to get in the way. Representative Lewis, we thank you for your service. May you rest in peace, and may your memory be a blessing. Gabby?
Thank you, Shelley, for that beautiful dedication. As Shelley mentioned, this is our 6th episode of Everyone's Welcome, and I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you who are here with us. But for those who don't know me, I work as the Chief Program Officer at Jewish Learning Venture in Philadelphia, and we work to make sure that all of our synagogues, schools, and Jewish spaces are as inclusive and as accessible for all people, including people with disabilities and their families, as possible. It is my pleasure to be here with Shelley today and with our guest, Aaron.
Absolutely. And I'm Shelley Christensen. I live in Minneapolis, and just so happy to be here. And we have some regulars who come all the time, and I want to thank them for being here. And for all of you for being here today. And we hope that your attendance will help spread the word, especially as we go into these times where inclusion and belonging are so critical to people's mental health, people's physical health, people's spiritual health. So without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce my friend Aaron Kaufman.
Well, thank you, Shelley. It is such a joy to be here today with 2 giants of the Jewish disability inclusion movement, Shelley Christensen and Gabby Kaplan-Mayer. They are wonderful people who have done so much for this community for decades, both in the secular community and the Jewish community. And I am deeply honored to be here. And I also want to thank my friend Alana Raffel, who's doing captioning, because she is part of that next generation of disability leadership and works day in and day out as an OT, helping people with disabilities reach their full potential. So I assume you have some questions for me, Shell.
We do. Gabby, I think you're up.
Yeah, Aaron, I actually want to jump in and ask you a personal question about what led you to do your work.
Well, I came into the disability rights movement sort of by birth, and I say that half in jest, but what I mean is that I was born with cerebral palsy, and many people will say, oh, it's just so wonderful that I have a disability, it's the best part about me. But unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. I think it's very unfortunate that I have cerebral palsy, and I'd rather not have it. But each of our friends on the call today has a challenge too, whether it's being divorced, whether it is another sort of medical condition, or just everyone has difficulty in their lives. And so I faced a choice, and I said, well, this is my difficulty, but I am going to use that and make lemonade out of lemons, because there are people like my brother with more significant disabilities. He's 3 years older and he has cerebral palsy too, but he needs assistance with all activities of daily living, such as showering, shaving, feeding, etc. And so I said, basically, it could be a lot worse, and I'm going to use my voice and my passion to improve the lives of people with disabilities. And I've done that since I was a very young age. When I was 18, I worked with my local county, Montgomery County, Maryland, to get all of the polling places made accessible. And I was the vice chair of the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council and the vice chair of the Montgomery County Commission on People with Disabilities. So I've really perfected being a vice chair, I guess you could say.
Aaron, one of the things that always amazes me, is your vast knowledge of policy and what's going on in Congress. And you're just such an amazing leader, not just in the Jewish community, but in the interfaith community as well. So with your great body of knowledge, and we're here recognizing the 30th anniversary of the ADA, can you tell us how the ADA came about and what it involves?
Yes. Let me preface though, Shelley, by saying I owe a lot to people like former Congressman Major Owens, Steny Hoyer, Steve Bartlett, Orrin Hatch, Tom Harkin, and advocates like Judy Heumann and Pat Wright, because I was 3 when the ADA was passed. So I don't remember a time without the ADA. So the ADA was, it was the culmination of years of effort. In 1968, you had the Architectural Barriers Act, which was the beginning of removing physical barriers. Then, thanks to Judy Heumann's protests in Secretary Califano's office during the Carter administration, you had Section 504, which said that entities that receive federal funds could not discriminate against people with disabilities. But all of those, and then you had, an important civil rights bill in 1991, but all of those pieces of legislation were great first steps. So, but they weren't enough, Shelley, in that I take for granted, because it's all I remember, that I can go to the movies, that there'll be ramps, that there'll be lifts, that there'll be accessible buses. But all of that was done because of the protesting and hard work and perseverance of my forebears. And for some of the history, I recommend that you watch Crip Camp, which is an amazing documentary on Netflix right now. But as it almost didn't happen because for 2 principal reasons. Number one, there are many different factions of the disability community. There's the blind community, there's the physically disabled community, there is the psychiatric disability community, and they have different needs. For example, the bumps on curb cuts are not great for people like me who use a walker, but my friends who are blind need them. So I run this thing called Jewish Disability Advocacy Day, and Senator Harkin, who is the lead author of it, spoke at it, and he said that the ADA almost fell apart because the disability community could not come together on a bill that everyone was happy with. And so he said, he was so frustrated, he walked into a room of disability advocates across the disability spectrum uh, and said, I have something to do, but if you all don't come to an agreement in 90 minutes, I'm going to pull the bill. Secondly, it almost didn't come to be because the ADA protects people with HIV and AIDS. And back then, many lawmakers felt that having HIV or AIDS was the wrath of God for being gay, and they did not want people with HIV and AIDS to be protected by the ADA because they thought it was retribution for their sins. And that is very backward thinking, but that was the thinking back then. So it almost didn't pass, but it did. It's not perfect, and I'll get into some of that later.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to follow up on that with a two-part question, which is to say, what do you feel has been achieved in the last 30 years since the passage of the ADA? And a second part to that question is, what do you think is lacking in the ADA?
Well, I think that the ADA, and I've told Steny Hoyer this several times in my work as a lobbyist for JFNA, because I believe he is the only one that was a lead author of the ADA that's still in Congress. I said, Mr. Hoyer, you and Mr. Harkin and Mr. Hatch and Mr. Bartlett and Mr. Owens, all of you changed my life. Because of you, I can, when I go to a hotel room, there's an accessible shower. Because of you, there are curb cuts. Because of you, restaurants have to be accessible. Because of you, when you go to an amusement park, they have to make accessibility accommodations. Because of you, employers have to make reasonable accommodations. But I think that, so it really has had a transformational effect on my life. When you look at the fact that Judy Heumann had to sue to be allowed to teach because they said she was a fire hazard during a fire drill. I didn't have to fight those battles, and I'm very grateful. And the ADA also didn't just help people like me, the 57 million people with disabilities. It helps moms with strollers and older adults who might not be deaf, but benefit from the closed captions because their hearing is not as good as it used to be. Two big failings are, one, it excluded churches, synagogues, and mosques. And that is especially disheartening because they lobbied successfully to get themselves excluded. And also, I think laws can't change attitudinal barriers, but and so it's not the fault of those wonderful people that passed the ADA, but I still think there's so much stigma associated with disabilities and anxiety and fear of lawsuits and liability that it's just still very difficult to live with a disability in this country, because quite often when I interact with people, I can tell they're uncomfortable, and I have to make a joke. Like when I'm on the Hill, I sense that the aide is struggling a little bit because I'm disabled. I will say, my name is Aaron Kaufman. I'm the Senior Legislative Associate for Disability Policy at the Jewish Federations of North America. And then I point to my walker over here and I say, for obvious reasons, and everyone chuckles. But I do believe there's still a great deal of hesitancy on the part of employers and on the part of just society in general. We've gotten to the point where people are, still very comfortable with having people with disabilities as a friend, but I think there's still a great frontier and still some unease when it comes to deeper relationships like dating.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aaron.
We see that so often, and there's still that otherism that exists them and us,
Well,
so to speak.
yeah, can I just say something very quickly? I
Of
have to,
course.
because I have to say that I think part of that unease, part of this belief that people with disabilities, for lack of a better term, are foreign objects to be afraid of, so to speak, is due to parents. Because when I'm in a mall or when I walk around and little kids say, um, Mommy, what's wrong with him? Why does he use that? Why is he walking like that? The parent will inevitably say, shh, don't say anything, which makes it seem like I'm scary or that my disability is something that's taboo, not to be discussed, just because they're afraid their kid will say the wrong thing. But it just perpetuates that fear. So I usually say, I use a walker because my legs aren't as strong as yours. I have a disability called cerebral palsy. And the kid's like, okay, but I think disability is largely a taboo subject still.
Which is so fascinating and interesting, because we also see that in the language that we hear, instead of using the term disability, which is across all legislation is the term that's used. We still hear special needs or, euphemisms. And one of those big opportunities I think we all have is to encourage and even demand that we don't use euphemistic language, which kind of takes us to the next question we have for you, Aaron. It's this: what advice do you have for faith communities who are seeking to be more accessible and inclusive?
Well, I think that two things. I just want to piggyback on what you said about euphemisms first. I taught special ed, and I had a student named Jane. That's not her real name, but I'm going to just say Jane. And one day, everyone in the class, including myself, had a disability. And so she said to me that I said, everyone in the class, including Mr. K, has a disability, but it's all about creating strategies that work for us to work around our disabilities. And she raised her hand and she said, Mr. K, I don't have a disability. And I said, Jane, yes, you do, because you wouldn't be in my classroom if you didn't have one. And she got very upset, and her mother got upset with me and said, we don't use that word, we say she has some challenges. But you can't get services from the state by going up to your state developmental disabilities administration or VR agency and saying, hello, I have some challenges. So it's all about, you can't access the service if you dance around services if you dance around it. So in terms of what faith communities can do, obviously put in a ramp or an elevator or mobility aids or large print or braille prayer books in your church, in your mosque, in your Buddhist temple, wherever you worship. But I would also say that it's really about being truly welcoming and inclusive, not just, hey, we have somebody with a disability that came to the services or came to mass. Wonderful, isn't that great? It's about talking to that person and being engaging and really making them feel welcome and making their aides feel welcome also, because I hear from plenty of friends that, oh, I go to church or I go to synagogue or whatever, and the people are really nice to me, but they're not nice to my aide. So I don't think I'm going to go back because my aide is my friend and I don't want him to feel uncomfortable. And I also think, though, that I recently spoke to a Federation exec who I won't name that said, well, the synagogue doesn't have money to put in an elevator. And that I understand that some of the modifications will be too expensive, but you got to start somewhere. So if you can't afford an elevator, buy a portable ramp for $100. And the thing is that people get all nervous about accommodations being expensive, but the fact is that most accommodations cost $500 or less, and a lot of them cost nothing at all. And one last point is that people will say, well, we don't need an accessible bima or an accessible altar or whatever, because We don't have people with disabilities in our congregation. And I will say, you may not now, but I wish all of you good health, but demographics indicate that a bunch of you will be joining me in the Walker Club at some point. So you may not need an accommodation now, but you will need an accommodation later. And lastly, do it, because if you don't accommodate, you won't only lose the person with a disability, you'll lose their whole family, because they're not going to go someplace where their loved one with a disability is not made to feel welcome.
Thank you, Aaron. So we want to invite anyone who has a question for Aaron. Feel free to go ahead now and put it into the chat box. And Aaron, I'm going to read one that came in from Benjamin that was similar to my question about, you know, what's lacking in the ADA. And Benjamin asks, where do you think the ADA falls short? And I'm thinking about the fact that you talked about being able to go to movie theaters and restaurants, but I know many times when I've looked at restaurants in my community, there might be an accessible entrance, but sometimes it might be blocked by, you know, packages or something. Like the staff may not be doing what they need to do. So I'm wondering if you can address ways that the ADA has fallen short.
Well, I think one major way that the ADA has fallen short is, number one, you're absolutely right, Gabby. I have to constantly advocate, and it is so wearying. But I also have to be mindful to do it nicely, because I once had a colleague of mine who was able-bodied say, Aaron, I really like working with you because I've worked in this field for 30 years, and you're so nice. And most people I've dealt with disabilities are so militant and angry. But so I think that one of the areas where the ADA has fallen short is employment. The unemployment rate and labor force participation rate for people with disabilities is god awful. And it's been that way since 1990. And I moderated a panel yesterday, and this person said that was their greatest disappointment. And so I think that has really fallen short. I also think in some ways the founders of the ADA made too many compromises. I know they had to do it to get it passed, but not only did they exempt houses of worship, but they said that employers didn't have to provide accommodations for people with disabilities if it caused a financial hardship. They said renovations only had to be made if the renovation was readily achievable. They said that anything built before July 1992 could remain inaccessible barring any significant renovations. And that's how legislation works, and that was what that's legislative sausage making, and that was what was required to get the Chamber of Commerce not to oppose the bill. But I think in some ways it didn't go far enough.
Thank you, Aaron. This next question here's another important one. I love everyone's questions. This is from Ben Krim here in the Philadelphia area. And Ben wants to know what you think. What is the next generation of civil rights issues that we need to advocate for?
Well, I think the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin have underscored how racist in many ways our country is. And there are many, many African Americans and Latinos with disabilities. And so I think that we need to take a hard look at why, for example, African Americans are more likely to have cerebral palsy than white people, and why Latinos are less likely to be diagnosed with autism, in terms of not because they have so much more of a lower rate of autism, but physicians tend to take the concerns of minority parents less seriously. So I think within the disability space, it is imperative that we look at the inequities faced by people of color with disabilities. And my friend, Dr. Angel Miles, who is a PhD who focuses on the additional challenges that African Americans have being disabled as compared to me as a white person, will be on a JFNA webinar on August 5th at 3 o'clock. And so I urge people to join that webinar and really consider that having a disability is hard enough, but that being a person of color with a disability, or a trans person with a disability, or a gay person with a disability just adds yet more difficulty because of stigma.
Thank you, Aaron. We have 2 more questions, so thanks for hanging in. We always say that our webinars go about 30 minutes, but we appreciate Aaron standing by to answer everyone's questions. So I'm gonna just keep sending them your way, Aaron.
Yeah, I have time, so.
Okay, thank you so much. So Joni Kalem shared that she has been in touch with you about this before, but that her local Jewish community doesn't have an inclusion coordinator, and the lack is very reflected in attitudes in her area. She's been petitioning the community to hire someone, but hasn't had any luck, and wondering if you have any suggestions.
Well, let me preface my remarks by saying I will not despair. You have expressed to me your frustrations about your federation and things before, but I will not disparage the people that put food on my table, so to speak. So forgive me, but you know, I'm not going to say anything bad. But what I can say is I certainly understand the frustration, and what you need to do is twofold. Karen at JFS Columbus and one of her, because I know you live in Columbus from talking to you, and one of her employees, Angela Bellin, are downright amazing disability advocates, along with June Gutterman, who recently retired. So talk to them, get advice from them, because they are firecrackers in a good way, and they will not stand for a not inclusive environment. And I also would say that, you know, you just have to raise a lot of cane and then get 10 friends to raise cane, and however you want to gently protest is up to you, but, you know, somehow let your displeasure be known. And so I wish you luck, and I'm always here for you, Jenny.
Thank you, Aaron. This is
Aaron,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just really want to say, Aaron, raising cane should be our motto. So appropriate.
Aaron, this is coming from Laura, who's also coming to us from the Minnesota area near Shelley. And Laura wants to know, what's the hardest thing that you had to learn when growing up?
The hardest thing that I had to learn when growing up was just all of that my life was going to be so much harder than my peers without disabilities. And, you know, don't get me wrong, a lot of my friends right now are pregnant with expectant babies, and I wish everybody all of my friends have healthy babies. But I just really was bitter that all these kids on the playground and different things had it so much easier than I did. So I really tried to hide my disability as much as possible and not address it as, you know, and then not address it as much as I could, avoid it as much as I could, not hang out with a lot of people with disabilities, which I feel terrible now about as an adult. But I hated that part of myself, and I just wanted to, avoid it as much as I could. And so I think that, and it took a lot of therapy and work and different things. So just adjusting to life as a person with a disability was the hardest part, and not being resentful or bitter towards people all the time.
Thank you, Aaron. We have one more question. So this is something we've talked about over the course of the conversation, but Stacy has asked it real specifically, and so I think it's a perfect one for us to close on. She works with synagogues and Jewish organizations that do in fact have inclusion committees working, and sometimes when they try to advocate for changes and accommodations, the pushback might come from clergy or from board of trustees. And so are there any suggestions about trying to influence change and growth in our Jewish community to all our leaders, I think is the question.
Well, I get that from clergy one time. I spoke once, and a rabbi came up to me and said, that was a really nice talk, but you have to realize synagogue budgets are small, and the people of color in the congregation want something, and the LGBTQ Jews want something. And so every interest group, so to speak, is pining for the small synagogue budget pie. And then I said, I understand that, Rabbi, and synagogues are never flush with cash, but I think what you're missing is that people with disabilities make up all those categories that you just listed. Be they, because there are Jews of color with disabilities, there are people with disabilities that are Jews that are LGBTQIA, and so we make up all of those different categories. And I said, you have to think about the long term, because while many people with at your synagogue may not need a ramp right now, they'll need it later. And I also just think that people with disabilities have to be firm. My synagogue, for example, that I won't name, was having a capital campaign to renovate the synagogue, and and they asked me and my parents and I for some money, and we said, we are not going to give to the capital campaign until the Bima is accessible, until there's a ramp to the Bima. And we got a few other families to withhold their capital campaign donation until that occurred, and lo and behold, they did it. I also feel that a lot of people are resistant to accommodations because when they look at me, they confront their own mortality. Anyone still there?
Yes, we're here, Aaron. Shelley just put the slide up.
We're here. I just put the slide. I was preparing. Sorry.
And Stacy, it's good to talk to you. I know you, but I will put my email in the chat should any of you have questions. And hopefully Shelley can save the chat so anyone who has insomnia tonight and is viewing the webinar can contact me also.
Aaron, when I send out a thank you in the recording, I will be sure to include your email address. Thank you for sharing it.
My pleasure.
You know, Aaron, when you were talking about what to say to faith community, to clergy, and to lay leaders and so forth, I was just thinking, to bring everything full circle, that the mandate is a moral one, to follow the ADA certainly, but the mandate is a moral one. It's not about money. Money can be a part of it certainly, but it doesn't define what that.
And a budget is a statement of values. So go ahead, sorry.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you, Aaron. As always, I could just listen to you for hours. I don't know if you ever want to talk for hours, but I can always listen to you. And I want to thank all of you today too for joining us. Gabby and I are both authors, and we always like to share our work. at the end, this is my book, From Longing to Belonging. And From Longing to Belonging is a guide for faith communities and religious organizations to follow as they seek to become more welcome, more inclusive, and certainly to eliminate those obstacles in all aspects of faith community life that we encounter, be they physical barriers, attitudinal obstacles, and communication obstacles. In Gabby's wonderful book. Gabby?
Thanks, Shelley. So this is my memoir of my amazing great uncle, Mace Bugan. I'm really happy my mom and dad were on today's webinar. It's my mom's uncle. And my uncle was 43 inches tall. He was born in 1915. So when we think of the 30th anniversary of the ADA, he lived in a time way beyond any kind of accommodations. And he really, Aaron, your spirit and the strength that you have reminds me a lot of what was inside my uncle. He made sure that he was considered part of the community. He lived in a time when people were very ignorant and would not only the kind of polite way that you described the encounter with the parent and the child, but that people would feel that they could stare at someone who looked differently. And his life story was really a great adventure and one full of fun. So I capture that in the book. And Shelley, here we are wrapping up our 6th episode. We're so grateful to everyone who joined us. We are grateful once again to Aaron. On August 13th at 7 p.m., we hope you'll join us for a conversation with Dr. Stephen Shore. We're so excited for that, and we'll let you know when the recording is up. We put them all on YouTube so that if this was moving today to you, you can share with your community, with your clergy, with leaders who might need to learn more about the ADA and our moral mandate, as Shelley shared. And I'll share the link to our jkidaccess.org page where all of our episodes live. So thank you for being part of today's conversation. Stay safe, be well, and take care of yourself.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
You bet. And thank you, Alana,
Aaron.
again for captioning for us today.
Yes, thank you, Alana. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.